Hey guys, it's Paige and Danae, and we're going to be giving you guys a look into our needs analysis and annual plan for the Grove City College men's soccer team. So just to give you guys an overview of what we're going to be covering, we're going to start off by just giving an overview of what men's soccer looks like at the D3 level at Grove City College specifically, and then we're going to go into the energy demands of the sport. We're going to do a biomechanical analysis. We're going to cover all the common injuries that are typically seen in men's soccer, and then we're going to go over the fitness testing structure as well as the annual strength and conditioning plan and what that looks like broken down both in season and off season. So men's soccer at Grove City College is both a fall and spring sport. However, the primary season does happen in the fall and it runs from around mid-August when preseason starts to about early November. And then the short spring season takes place from around mid-March to mid-May, so it's about 2 months long. And during that time, they are just doing some scrimmages and team practices. So looking at the games, regular season games usually last about 90 minutes long, and then there's always a chance for a possible 20-minute overtime depending on the score at that point. So now moving on to the energy demands. So the work to rest ratio will typically vary depending on a couple things. It can vary based on position or opponent. It can also vary based on scenario and just the situation of the game. However, we found that a compressed ratio will generally look like a 4-to-1. After talking to Coach Dreves at Grove City, we found out that he actually uses a GPS tracking system, which just tracks the range of his players and just their speed during practices and games. And so what he found is that about 10% of the game is played at a sprinting pace, which ends up calculating at about 11 miles per hour. Um, However, during the rest of the game, players are typically playing at a walk or a jog. However, this can also vary depending on the time remaining in a game. What we'll typically see is a lot of players will increase their intensity, especially at the end, just to get a few last minute points in. And so that hustle really does increase at the end. However, what we want to do is we want to train the players and prepare them for the worst case scenario, which will be that 10% of the game where they are at a sprinting pace. Men's soccer really does use all energy systems just because the intensity of the game can really go up and down so much. So the players are always just changing the level of energy that they're exerting. So, for instance, if they're like moving around the field at a pretty moderate intensity, that would be utilizing the aerobic system. But contrasting, like if they were to be sprinting long lengths of the field to chase down a ball, or to chase down a player, that would be using the lactic acid system. So again, that can really change throughout the game depending on the pace. Okay, so now looking at the biomechanical analysis, we're just going to break down a lot of the movement demands that we see in the sport. So some of the primary movements for men's soccer, one of the most common ones is cutting, and that'll usually show the highest level of soreness in practices and games. We'll also see a lot of jumping movements, and coming off of that, we'll see a lot of landing movements. Another common movement in men's soccer is player-on-player defensive movements, so that's just learning how to work through contact and defending the ball. Overall, though, one of the main things that we see is that movements are explosive, and so what we're trying to do is prepare our players to make explosive movements on the ball. Um, and so looking into planes of motion, a lot of the movements are in a straightforward plane. So for instance, if we're using a kicking motion, that'll usually cross the sagittal and frontal planes, while if we're moving in a short space and we're working from a dribble to a pass, that'll be crossing the lateral plane. So now we're going to look into force production. Soccer is obviously not a sport where you're using your hands a lot, and so most of the force is coming from the lower body and the lower extremities. So we see that most of the force will come from the hips, and it'll also come from the hamstrings, the glutes, and the quads. And you can kind of see a breakdown of that if you look at the picture on the right. However, most of the force does trace back to coming from the hips. So now we're going to move on to common injuries that we see in men's soccer. For Grove City specifically, some common injuries that we've seen in the program over the past 2 years are in the knee, the groin, the calf, the hip, the hamstring, and the ankle. So those are all common areas that most injuries will occur in. About 80.6% of injuries in men's soccer does come from contact and collision. And statistically, most injuries will end up impacting the lower extremities. So, kind of like I said before, the ankle, the knee, the thigh, and the hip. So, just knowing the commonality of all these injuries will overall help us to design a program where we can really just strengthen the areas that are susceptible to injury and, more importantly, just prepare them for contact. So now looking at the general needs analysis, we have a couple goals for this program. First of all, we want to address the injuries. Like I just said, injury prevention is super important. So we want to build up our players in areas where we know that they're weak or we know that they are susceptible to injuries. So that way, when they do come into contact, which we know is pretty much inevitable in this sport, we know that they'll be less likely to come down with an injury. Another goal is that we want to really capitalize on explosive movements and being progressive in everything that we do with the ball. And also going off of that, we want to have proper positioning. Everything starts with good form. And so, especially when we're accelerating and decelerating, we want to make sure that we do have good form so that way we can set ourselves up for success.
So moving on and looking at our fitness testing structure, we are going to test our athletes right after their first season of competition and then again right before their second season of competition starts. So for fundamental movement, we are going to perform the functional movement screen. And so this would just test the athlete's movement patterns and their form and see where we potentially might need to improve. For speed and agility quickness, this would test the athlete's abilities to change direction and how fast they can do it. And we were going to do this by looking at the Arrowhead COD speed test. So then for power, when we were talking to Coach Dreves, he really emphasized the importance of power in soccer, especially whenever an athlete goes to cut or change direction. So we are going to test this by doing a vertical jump test, and this would just tell us the athlete's split second like explosiveness, opposed to the shuttle where we would be looking at the power they have in changing direction and after changing direction. So then for strength, the squat is pretty much a whole body lift, but it does primarily focus on the lower body. And as Paige said earlier, we need to be strong in order to prevent injuries because soccer is primarily a lower body sport. So then for endurance, we would do the beep test, and this is a relatively common test that is performed by athletes, and it just tests the distance that the athlete can run and the speed that the athlete can do it at. So here's our strength and conditioning annual plan, and it's kind of hard to see in the picture, but during both competition seasons, we would have the athletes only lifting 1 to 2 days a week, and this is just to maintain the level of strength and power that they have. And then during the first off season, we would have them do a linear periodization scheme, and during the second off season, we would have them do an undulating periodization scheme, and the athletes would do this 3 to 4 days a week because this is the time that we're trying to build the strength and power of the athletes. So for our off-season programming, we do have a lot of lower body exercises for the athletes to perform, but we do also have a couple upper body exercises just to kind of balance out the muscle groups. But since soccer is primarily using your lower body, it's good to have a lot of strength in the lower body. So for hypertrophy, you can see that we have higher reps and a lower amount of sets. And then for strength, we have a high number of sets and then a lower number of reps. So then just continuing in the off-season programming, For power, we have a higher number of sets with a lower number of reps, and usually there is a higher intensity at this period just to focus on the explosiveness for power. For power endurance, we have a lower number of sets and more of like a middle range of reps. For movement preparation in our program, we just have our athletes start out with some like just easy stretching just to kind of loosen up their muscles. And then as they start to activate their muscles, we kind of have them do some isometric holding positions, like the planks and the glutes that you see here. And then they move into more dynamic movements where they're actually moving like around the room in order to just get their muscles moving before we put stress on them. So as I said earlier, soccer players need a lot of endurance. And so this training protocol really just has them moving at different speeds for a different amount of time. And this is seen a lot in soccer, so it's good to get the athletes used to this type of movement, to have them be used to type of the demands that they are going to see in a regular game. So as I said earlier, when I was looking at the annual plan, during the season, when they're doing strength and power, we're really just looking to maintain the levels that they have. So really we'd just be doing core lifts and little sets and making sure that the athletes get plenty of rest because we don't want them to be too fatigued whenever they go to perform in a competition so they can perform at their peak level. And so also with the circuit, we would just really have them do more like stability and mobility movements to just keep them ready for competition.